we all know that Bach is not done in one way. There's a lot of different, everyone's got their own way of doing it. Colin Corner, remember he said to me one time, I took lessons with Colin for a while when he was living in Rochester, and he said, fingerings are like a toothbrush. You never want to use somebody else's.
We're digging into Bach and playing Bach cello suites in the lower positions today. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and today we're bringing back University of Fredonia bass professor Kieran Hanlon. I had Kieran on the podcast back in 2017, talked to him live at the International Society of Bassists Convention in Ithaca, New York, and it was great to sit down and dig into his career. He's had a fascinating path through the music world, and he's really doing great things out there in New York State. So this episode, it's a quick one, and it's all about Kieran's Bach project. We're going to dig right in. I just want to give a quick shout out at the beginning to my sponsors. No other reads besides that, but thank you so much for the people that keep the lights on here, and that is Steve Swan String Bass, D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, A440, and Colstein Music. Let's dig into this conversation about this cool project with Kieran Hanlon. Practical Bach for the double bass is the title, right? Your Bach project. I've been looking through the site, and you've got videos, you got PDFs, and I read a little bit about it. So just maybe start with the how did you get the idea for this Bach project? When did that start?
Yeah, well, it's been on my mind for a while. One of the things that really got me thinking about it was, do you know Ed Castellano? Have you met him in your travels?
I'm familiar, yeah.
Yeah, so, Ed for a long time was principal in Syracuse, and then after the orchestra, unfortunately, sort of met its end, he's now playing full-time in Rochester. That's where I got to know him when I was subbing there, and great guy. We had a lot of fun. But he was talking about playing the D minor prelude, second suite prelude, in D minor, starting an open D string, Mm-hmm. And I got to thinking, that's really, really, really great, And I had always, it was nice to have someone, older, just older than me and more experienced, kind of get behind that idea, because it had bounced around my head a few times, thinking, why do we do this stuff so high? It's like you're trying so hard. And again, I really want to preface everything by saying there's absolutely a place for that, and I think people do it so beautifully and it's so effective. I think I'm always thinking about my students, and myself as a young player, and I was just barely hanging on for dear life just to half spit the notes out, some of these suites up in thumb position. And there's a note about this in the write-up that I wrote for the website. But my colleague David, who I used to teach with here, violin professor David Kowal, he used to say, maybe juries, I have someone come in and play Bach way down the end of the fingerboard, and he'd say, man, I just can't imagine playing Bach in 12th position.
Right. And it's a good point, because if anybody who sat down at the cello to play the prelude to the first Bach cello suite will remark at open, open, one, open, the first notes, or you with your background as a violinist, right. It is, if you just remove yourself from the bass world and think about it for a second, it is kind of weird to think about how we experience Bach typically as bass players versus the other string players.
Right. And another person that helped kind of get this thing moving in my head a little bit too was Mike Griffin. Mm-hmm. You may know Mike. He's assistant principal in Rochester, actually made my bass, and just a wonderful luthier, great player, great teacher, great all-around guy. But we were talking, I was teaching his son, Sam, and, of course, we were always in touch about what we thought would be best for Sam moving forward and this, that, the other thing. And we were actually just having a discussion about how sometimes playing lyrically and beautifully in the low register is harder than in the high register.
Yeah.
And for that reason, actually, to just get people like really thinking about playing solos in the low end, is just good for your playing in general, to just help develop, like I think I'd say, like the kind of the elegance and control in the bottom end of the bass that we all need in the orchestra. I think the bass is, like we were just talking about, has experienced such a wonderful renaissance in the last 20 years. People are doing all kinds of amazing things. But I know from a practical standpoint, you got to be able to play well in the low register to just be, I think, marketable,
right.
and just for, again, step one, like you're going to go out and be a professional bass player, you got to be able to hang in the low register, right? So I think through the solo rep in that register, we gain things that are different than practicing the trio of Beethoven 5, So anyway, Mike and Ed and I, we talked about this idea a lot. And so I started practicing some of these suites in the low register. And, obviously we have the Sterling editions that are in a lot of the keys that I'm using already. For me, what I found with the Sterling editions was, and I'm teaching with them too, some of the bowings and fingerings, again, for me, were not as appropriate or helpful as I would hope. And I'd be spending all this time in lessons, crossing this out, rewriting this, that, and the other thing. I'm sure you know what I mean.
I'm very familiar, yeah.
And so, I've done this with some other pieces too, which is a separate tab in the website. But I just make my own, so I don't have to spend that time in the lesson. I just go on the computer, print the PDF, hand it to the student, say, do this, and that's the bottom line. So I wanted to organize everything in that way. And sort of put again what I do. We all know that Bach is not done in one way. There's a lot of different, everyone's got their own way of doing it. Colin Corner, remember he said to me one time, I took lessons with Colin for a while when he was living in Rochester, and he said, fingerings are like a toothbrush. You never want to use somebody else's.
That's a good line. Yeah.
Yeah. Classic Colin too, very, very, right on the money. But I think that's really true. Because, like I say, you can do it many, many different ways. But what I wanted to do is just show what I did. And then also to, I think this one, I've noticed just in the conversations over the years that some people just say, no, you just can't play Bach down there. It's too low. And that's the end of the conversation. And so my hope was to offer an example through the video recordings so that people could sort of buy it, I guess. Now, that doesn't mean in any way that what I have is the answer, or that it's the only way to do it, or that it's, this should be done in place of high register. I don't want to say anything like that. I just wanted to add something and hopefully legitimize it, like I say, through the video recording so people can watch it. And then basically what I did in the editions, I have three separate PDFs. There's a fully blank one, right? So that could be like I thought of as a worksheet. I have one with just bowings, the bowings that I use, and then one with bowings and every single finger that I use. I actually did every note. And I could share that with you if you want to see it. But I did that because I just wanted people to have a reference point, not to say you have to do it, but just to have a reference point, see how I managed that, and then to also be able to watch it in the video was attractive to me.
Well, it's great to have all of those, because it really is nice to see exactly what you do, but it's also nice to be able to start with a complete blank page, right? And either as a teacher with a student or the student on their own or whatever combination, to be able to like build it from the ground up. So that, and like you, I can't tell you how much of my life has been spent like crossing out fingerings and bowings and various Sterling or other editions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I love that I love that you played all these examples, on the website. You've got some movements from the first suite. You got some movements from the second suite. If I'm remembering right. And yeah, it made me think, because I think about all the solo pieces that I have taught over the years and how upper register they really all are. And it really is great to think melodically down in the A string and the D string. And I mean, a lot of that, I think, traditionally has been reserved for teaching like Beethoven 5 or other excerpts like that. So yeah, really thinking about that, about the lower register of the bass melodically, and playing, obviously it's always a good day when you're playing Bach. So being able to play that down there, it's a great idea.
So, and then I think the other thing that was attractive to me beyond the technical considerations is the musical considerations. Like you say, it's always a good day to be playing Bach. And I think from, they can almost, again, I wrote this on the write-up too, but they can always be, I think they can always be thought of as a musical etude, in a way. It's got all the technical challenges and more of any of our favorite etudes. But it also has this, dare I say, genius influence, of J.S. Bach, and experiencing that and trying to make the most of that is good for us too, I think, as players and teachers,
Yeah, there's something about about thinking about Bach and the phrasing of Bach and all that without struggling the way that we might, or students might, when you're up in thumb position, and the intonation and the shifting and the considerations, and it's kind of nice to work on that music without some of those technical challenges that we typically have when we're playing up in thumb position and for the different suites.
Right. Well, when you think about, an excerpt like Beethoven 5 with the scherzo, the opening pianissimo scherzo, you think about checking out the prelude to the second suite and getting that comfort in the legato and that comfort, string crossings, all that kind of stuff. That's all going to apply to some of the orchestral work as well. And I think it's, I just think that's so important to sort of have that comfort down there, higher level than you need for the excerpts, or at the same, level, and just as part of your practice and vocabulary,
Now, people should check out the videos, but just remind me, in the first suite, what key are you playing the first suite in?
Yeah, so I do the first suite in C major.
Okay. That's what I thought.
And
okay.
Do the second suite in E minor. So those are the same as the stirring. And then I do have the bérets from the third suite, which are in the typical G major that most of us, I think, at least here in the States, tend to play them. But again, I just put my bones and fingerings in there, and also to have the worksheet. Honestly, I think the worksheet is going to be helpful to a lot of people that have their own feeling about it, just to have a blank canvas, that's so hard to get anymore, I think. IMSLP, there's stuff in there, of course, but this one's just nice and big. I try to format it so there's plenty of room and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, no, it's great. And you got some, I think I saw that you were chatting with Jeff Turner a bit about, wasn't he one of the artistic advisors? Did I see that?
Yeah. So when I was getting this together, I just called Jeff and said, do you think this is worth doing? You know, because of someone that has the amazing history that he has as a player and teacher, I thought he would really just have a good insight, like, well, Sterling's there, people mess with it, don't bother. And he said that he's been meaning to do something along the same lines, I think. Maybe he did say, this was a couple of years ago now. Excuse me, I don't know, I can't recall, but I know he teaches the first suite prelude in E minor. There's that factor for him that's important as well. So yeah, I spoke with Jeff, and also David Rose, who's our viola professor here at Fredonia. Unbelievable Bach player. Just check him out if you have a minute on YouTube. Just one of the most profound Bach guys I've ever heard. And actually, this is another point I wanted to make, unless you wanted to go.
Go for it.
I think it's an important consideration when we think about Bach, and I hope I don't incite any kind of riot in saying this. And again, I don't ever claim to have the answer or one way of doing it, whatever. But, the fact is, we're playing Bach on a big modern instrument with steel strings and a modern bow. And the question of whether to do that or not, I believe is, at least for bass players, maybe heading on the orchestral track, is sort of irrelevant, because orchestras generally expect you to play a movement of Bach on an audition with a modern setup, So for that reason, I think there has to be a practical and realistic consideration for what are we going for style-wise, And so I think we absolutely have to be aware of the Baroque style and playing in the Baroque style. But I think there has to be that element of realism with, we're playing on a modern instrument, so for me, I always tell my students to say, play very clean. We talk about usage of vibrato or not, all those kind of things. But in terms of truly playing it in a period style, historical performance wise, I think it's pretty tough to pull off on a modern instrument. Not to say that it can't be done, but back to David, that's a balance that I think he strikes beautifully. He plays everything at 440 with a modern setup, but it still captures the aura, I think, beautifully. So I really try to do that and instill that in my students as well. So.
Do you have any other plans to do other movements besides what you've done? What's on the horizon for this?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do some more for sure. I find that the ones that I have done so far, at least from the first and second suite, are probably the most practical to use. The other really good one in the second suite is the jig, but it really takes some time to get it together. I've started it and then had to pull away from it for one reason or another, and so that one is probably next on the horizon for me. Fourth suite Courant, I haven't explored yet, but I have a feeling it could work really well. And then something in the fifth suite, maybe the Sarabande. Yeah, I really want to get some more of this stuff done for sure. Right now, I haven't been able to find the time to really devote to it, because it's a big undertaking. Obviously getting the movement together and making the recording. The other thing too is those are one take recordings. I really wanted to, again, go with the idea of realism. I think so many recordings out there now are 100 pieces put together, and there's nothing wrong with that, because you're, I think, in a way, presenting the art in its most perfect form, which is great. I just like to inspire people in a slightly more realistic way. Like, if you're on stage playing a recital, here's how it's going to feel, here's how it's going to go. So anyway, that's a big part of it, is just getting it ready enough to be able to get through it and accept it, and then obviously the computer work, getting everything formatted and nice is pretty time consuming as well.
Yeah, it's extremely time consuming. So as I've someone who's tackled many a multi-faceted project, I could, and man, those one take recordings, there's nothing like getting to the last, 8 bars and something happens. You're like, oh, yeah. So.
And meanwhile, you're exhausted, right? Because you've just done the whole thing.
Well, I went through it and filmed. I was just sick and tired of there not being any or any consistent way to find those George Vance progressive repertoire pieces. And so I went through one day. I drank too much coffee one day and got inspired. And I spent the entire day filming all of volumes 1 and 2. So like the first 4, and I'm glad I did it, but I've gotten the requests like, what about book 3? It's like, well, I got to practice book 3. It's like Dragon Eddy movement 1. And so that's a project for me coming up. But yeah, but congratulations on doing this. It is a big task, but it's super helpful to have that out there. And I love that you have the 3 different versions, the blank, the bowings, and then with every fingering. I'm a huge fan of every fingering, putting, like really like that it might seem like too much detail for some people. I think it's really helpful to think about every note like that. And I tell my students to do that. And
yeah, well, it's funny too, because there's been so many times where I've written something in a lesson, I'm like, okay, this part's logical. And then I go to the next bit. And then the student comes back the next week doing something completely different in that spot that I thought would be obvious. And again, not to say there's one way to do anything, but sometimes I'm just like, man, because what I put on either side of it depended on, because then the middle, I expect them to connect the dots, but sometimes it just doesn't happen for one reason or another. So yeah, and, but it's tough too, because there's that whole give a man a fish. What's the line? It's you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man to fish, he eats for life, that kind of thing. I'm always careful with that too, because I like the students to have the chance to do their own exploration, but oftentimes I'll just hand them mine and say, look, here's a starting point, try it. And I'll tell you what, I use these Bach movements all the time when I'm teaching, and everyone always comes in and say, well, I like this better. And my feeling is like, okay, you sound good on that, do that, no problem. but again, it's just a starting point.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've had the same experience. The longer I teach, the less convinced I am that people should be doing the exact fingerings I do. But it's great to, because everybody's just has different hand sizes and bass sizes and musical temperaments and skills. Yeah. But it's great to have as a starting point. It's great to have that. So yeah, congratulations on this. This is super cool. KieranHanlonmusic.com, right, is where people can go. And then there's a tab up there, Bach Project, I think.
Yes, yeah. There's the Bach Project. And then there's also another transcriptions and editions page, which has a couple other pieces that I've done the same thing with. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember. I think those are just editions. There's not three. This was like over a year ago now I did it. But yeah, but there's no... They're just editions. There's some reference recordings. That's another thing on the list to get the other reference recordings in there. But the other page currently has Bottesini Elegy, Meditation from Thais, which another one I love to play because it gets down the low register quite a bit. And then I've transcribed second movement of the Bruch G minor violin concerto, which actually works out pretty well in the bass. It's quite hard, but sounds nice. Yeah. And third movement of Saint-Saëns A minor cello concerto, which
cool.
is a real handful, but again, it actually works out, so, but again, those are in there. They're set for bass and including the octave shifts I had to do, etc. So I would encourage people to also have a look over there. And the other thing, I always put this when I send the editions out and people order them, but by all means, send me questions. There's a fellow in England that bought a whole bunch of stuff, and he would send me a number of questions. Oh, I'm sorry. I said, no, it's great. I love to be able to answer and just help them to be relevant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And folks listening, Kieran and I chatted in person at the ISB convention last summer, so I'll put a link to that. But you learn all about his backstory, really interesting background. And like we said earlier, starting as a violinist and coming into the bass world and all the playing he does. And then also, I don't know if we talked about this when we were chatting at ISB, but isn't there some ridiculously great deal at Fredonia if you're a New York State resident? Isn't it like free or mostly free, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, so this is called the Excelsior Scholarship.
Okay.
And I would advise people the best thing to do is to go online and read about the Excelsior Scholarship. There's an income parameter system. Basically, depending on what your family income is, you're either eligible or not. And if you are eligible, then tuition is free for you at a state University of New York, whatever, any of the campuses. So it's an excellent program. I think it's affording some people the chance to go to school that haven't had a chance to go to school, or making it much more affordable to do so, which of course is going to be more and more relevant as time goes on. And yeah, it's a great program for sure. And again, it's tuition, so you don't want to be thinking about going to college for free. You still got your room and board and all that kind of stuff. But I always tell people, you got to pay to live anyway, So
yeah.
So that part you can expect to be, spending that money one way or the other. But yeah, the tuition factor is great, and even our non-Excelsior tuition is very, very competitive here. It's one of my favorite things about this place. Actually, is the price point is excellent. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so folks, check out Kieran's website. Check out Fredonia, regardless of where you live. But if you live in New York State or from New York State, definitely read about this Excelsior scholarship, and that's really exciting. And it's great to talk to you, man. I appreciate what you do, and you're up to all sorts of projects. And I know this is the first of many in the future. So I look forward to getting you back on the podcast for whatever those next projects might be.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and I appreciate everything you do too, man. It's like I can't keep up with what you're up to, and you're just really making the whole community much more cohesive and available, and just really, really great. So we appreciate that.
Kieran, thanks a bunch. Folks, Kieran Hanlon Music is his website. You can find the Bach project there, and it's all linked up in the show notes. So thank you, Kieran, for coming back, and can't wait to connect with Kieran coming back from Cuba. He's on this trip to Cuba, and I think that's super cool. I was in Cuba myself back in 2016, so we'll get Kieran back on for another round here at Contrabass Conversations, talking about what his experiences were like going to Cuba. Super cool, by the way. Highly recommend it. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Steve Hinchy, Michael Cooper, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch is making beautiful basses in the Dallas area. Look him up online at mitchmooring.com. Krista Copper is cataloging and archiving all these conversations, so big shout out to her, and a big shout out to all of you for listening. I really appreciate it as we go on this crazy journey through the bass world, through the music world, in the United States, internationally, at various events. It's just so much fun to do this and have you along on the journey. I am your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from San Francisco, California, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.